everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Andrea. This is like the video that I look forward to the most when other booktubers make them. So I've been really excited and I've been keeping track of what are my top 10 favorite books of the year as I was reading and readjusting. Two things before I get into the actual list. Number one, I did read the Harry Potter series for the first time this year. But for your sake and for mine, I've already talked about it for 3 videos and I'll link them all below. It's been a great reading experience. My favorite one of the series is the 6th book, The Half-Blood Prince, but I won't put it in the top 10 because even though it would be like number 1, of course, it wouldn't be fair to you guys. I will also not count rereads. These are not books that have been published in 2018. They are books that I've personally read in the calendar year of 2018. So coming in at number 10 is The Borrower. This book was given to me by my boss at the very beginning of the year, and this is a very personal choice. It's not particularly literary or anything like that, but it follows a 26-year-old librarian who lives alone in an apartment, and she's very invested in this one patron in the library who's a young boy, and he's gay, but his family is super religious, and they try to suppress that and even try to correct that by sending him to particular kinds of camps. And this librarian sort of takes it upon herself to save him and let him be who he is. Obviously the second half is kind of fantastical in some sense. For the first part, I just connected to this character because I was like, oh my god, that is exactly me. Coming in at number 9 is Stoner by John Williams. This book was recommended to me by Randall from the comment section, and I loved this book. It just reminded me of so many things. It reminded me of The Wars by Timothy Findley. It reminded me of The Inklings in many ways because Stoner has all these literary friends and they discuss literature so passionately. It reminded me of Dead Poet Society. And then it takes a turn and kind of reminds me of Revolutionary Road. So Stoner, even though he's an intellectual and a PhD and he studies literature, he falls in love with this woman and he means well, but he ends up failing her in a very significant way. And the way this book presents it to us, we get to see that Stoner is a great person. He means well. He loves his wife. But it's technically his fault in many ways that she didn't get to live out her dreams. And we get to see this sort of systematic oppression from like society as a whole, rather than him particularly oppressing his wife in any way. Just the way that Williams shows this was just so beautiful. It's very difficult not to love this book. Coming in at number 8 is a retelling of Beowulf, The Mere Wife. I have done an entire video on this and I'll link that below. But if I could sum this up in one sentence, this is a 21st century retelling of Beowulf, told from Grendel's mother's point of view. And she is a war veteran living in suburbia with a sort of monstrous child. It is so well done, and if you have read or studied Beowulf, paying attention to all the details will really pay off when you read this retelling. It's really well done, but because I've done a whole video on this, I'll just link that below, so if you are interested. Coming in at number 7 is The Gargoyle by Andrew Davidson. So the main character is working in the porn industry and he's very good looking, and he gets in a car accident. And for the very first maybe 100 pages, you just learn about his experience being burned. You get to learn about the procedures in the medical field and how they treat burn victims and how they take care of them, and the pain and the smells and just everything to do with this medical aspect of being a burn victim. And this character loses hope until he meets a young woman who has escaped the mental ward. And she tells him that she knows him because she's met him in a previous life. And she tells him all these stories of who he used to be. And these stories give him hope. In many ways, this book is kind of a praise for stories and their value and importance in a person's life. Now, number 6 is kind of a Mount Everest situation for me. This book was very long and I spent so much time in it, but I loved it. And that is The Grace of Kings by Ken Liu. This is something I'm reading for that fantasy series project where I read the first book in a fantasy series, and I've just finished this recently. And it's made me question what it is that makes a book fantasy, because in many ways this almost feels historical because there are no supernatural elements, there's hardly a magic system, but there are components that make it fantasy-like. This book differs from most fantasy books because it's inspired by Imperial China. The main plot takes place over several islands, the islands of Dara. And for the first half of the book, you get introduced to all these characters from each little island. And you're just waiting and waiting. But then when they all start to come together, it all becomes so much more beautiful, and it's worth all the time investment. And I'm very excited to get to book 2. I will say more about this in a fantasy video, but this was number 6 for the year. Number 5 was a really good surprise, and it's something I've also read quite recently, and it's Johannes Cabal, the Necromancer by Jonathan L. Howard. This book is Faust meets Good Omens. It's kind of like my style of dark humor, the same style that you would encounter in What We Do in the Shadows. I just love when people take really morbid things and they combine it with the right level of humor and kind of laugh in its face. And this does this so well. So Johannes Cabal meets Satan and says, "Hey, I'm a scientist. We made a deal once and I sold you my soul and I want it back." And Satan says, "Okay, fine, you can have it back, but I'm going to need you to acquire 100 souls in 1 year. And they have to willingly give you their souls to give to me." And he also gives him this sort of traveling circus. So now he has to do this task. And the humor and the interactions are hilarious. If you did enjoy something like Good Omens, you might really love this. But what really intrigued me is that this character, Johannes Cabal, this is a series. So there's actually 5 books, I think, up to date. And it's kind of like, watch the Necromancer do this now. I will be continuing on with this series because I really loved this book. Number 4 was a surprise. So this is a poem that I read for the Classics-a-thon, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel L. Coleridge. And I had heard that this was a great classic, and as I was reading the poem, I kept wondering, like, what makes this so great? Because the language is not incredible. I've read much more impressive poetry, but as I went through it and really thought about the imagery and the story being told, it suddenly became fascinating. Our main protagonist is stuck in the Arctic on a ship, and they're stuck in the ice, and an albatross shows them the way out. And when they come out, instead of thanking the bird and praying to the gods for his good luck, he shoots the bird. And after that, things take a weird turn. The gods sort of interfere and put him off course, and he's stuck at sea, and weird things start happening. Death and the life of death play dice over this person's life and the life of the crew. And death acquires the crew, and they're all dead. And a life of death acquires the soul of the main guy. The images that this book as a whole contains, like if you Google some of the illustrations for this, you'll see what I mean. Like there are moments of complete sadness and some that are just downright creepy, like having the weight of the dead albatross around his neck. And just, it's so beautiful. I loved it. I'm so glad I read this. Worth every minute. Highly recommend. So, number 3 shouldn't come as a surprise, but it's The Ship of Magic. So this book follows Althea Vestrit. There's a whole family and they have these live ships. The ships come to life. I've talked about it many times already, and I will talk about it once more once I finish the full trilogy. So I will say no more on this, as I'm sure you've seen this everywhere on BookTube. This is like the Luna Lovegood of BookTube fantasy. Everyone loves this. Number 2 was the most beautiful reading experience I've had in terms of escapism. I cannot say this book is high on the literary scale or that there are reasons why you should read it other than pure escapism and if these things sound interesting to you. So I'm talking about Daphne du Maurier's Frenchman's Creek. There was once a challenge on Twitter to summarize a book in like 7 words, and I think someone said something like, horny bored housewife meets sexy French pirate. And I think that kind of describes this book very well. The adventure scenes are very much in the style of the Three Musketeers. So this book follows Donna, who is very bored in her personal life and goes to her summer home. And she starts to get involved with some pirates and really helps them on this heist because they're very much against the sort of middle upper class of that region, and they kind of rob them and they're an inconvenience to them. Everything about this, like the imagery of being out at sea, just the ships and the pirates and everything, wonderful. So if that sounds interesting to you, please read it. But if you think that it might be saved by, you know, high language and great metaphors, this is not that book. But it was my second favorite book of the year. I love it. I can't wait to reread it. It was great. Now my favorite book of the year is something I read in the first half of the year, and I've already read this twice. I loved this book. When I closed the final cover, I felt the need to talk about it. I did a whole written review on this, but it's The Heart's Invisible Furies by John Boyne. Some people were talking about this last year, and I've seen it on a lot of people's channels, and I was like, okay, you know, I'll give it a go. What could be so amazing about this book? Wow, it was incredible. Our main character, Cyril Avery, knows early on that he is gay because he has fallen in love with his best friend and roommate, Julian. They kind of meet when they're kids, and their lives kind of cross paths many, many times. The birth and conception of Cyril had some unfortunate circumstances, and his mother was kicked out of her own little village for it, and she has to put him up for adoption because she's very, very young, but she's one of the most kick-ass women I have ever seen on paper. Cyril is taken in by this family, and the people who take him in kind of remind me of the sort of Gertrude Stein, F. Scott Fitzgerald type of people who would entertain other artists at their home, and they themselves were kind of renowned artists. And his adoptive mother really reminded me of Gertrude Stein because she was kind of cold and distant, and her parenting style is a little bit cold and detached, but she is also an active shadow in Cyril's life for the time being. And there's a third woman who's also incredible, and she gets introduced later on. What this book does successfully for me is A, it shows you the struggle of this main gay protagonist, but also how it affects more than just himself as one person. It affects everyone around him. There are people he ends up hurting and people who hurt him because of this one thing that society just won't allow to happen. And we get to see him in certain parts of his life. This book kind of covers every 7 years for his entire life, and we get to see only the interesting bits. And it starts off in Dublin, we get to Amsterdam, and then eventually we make it to New York during the AIDS epidemic, and then back to Dublin. And it's such a beautiful circular narrative, and the language is so beautiful, and the characters are all so well developed. And Cyril is so interesting as a character because there's something about him that's so incredibly innocent, and this kind of innocence comes through in kind of light humor. There were 2 instances in this book that I will say kind of upset me because I found that they happened too conveniently at the right time, and it relied on that kind of divine intervention, great timing, coincidence. But given that it's looking at every 7 years, like in a lifetime, sometimes you really do have those moments where it's like, wow, that just happened at the right time. So given the kind of context of how this has been written, I can see that that's okay, and I was willing to let that go. But all in all, this was my favorite book of the year, and I read it in February, and I keep thinking about it to this day. I cannot get it out of my head. It is stellar, it is well written, the language is phenomenal, and every character is developed to the full potential. That was my top favorite books of the year. I hope that you have at least read one great book this year, and if you have, I would really like to know what were some of your favorite books of this year. So thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!